My name is Sarah Flack, and I'm a consultant, and I work with grass-based livestock producers. What we're going to talk about today is all of the different ways that you can figure out whether one of your pastures is actually ready to graze yet. And so this is something to do on a somewhat regular basis, especially if you're a beginner grazer, is walk around your farm and take a really close look at the plants right after they've been grazed off and throughout all of the different stages of them regrowing. So you can get familiar with the many different types of grasses and legumes and forbs growing in what are hopefully your really diverse pastures, and start to learn how each one grows back after being grazed so that you can take special care not to damage particularly the most desirable, productive, and palatable plants in your pasture. So one of the ways to decide if your pasture is ready to graze yet is to measure the height. And the grazing stick can be used to measure the total amount of dry matter available to graze per acre, but you can also just use it really simply just to measure the pre-grazing height. Most of the grazing sticks give you somewhere between 12 and 18 inches of height. In some cases, your pre-grazing height might be taller than that, but that works for a lot of pastures. So if you're walking around your farm, scouting your pastures, trying to decide if they're ready to graze or not, you can take a bunch of measurements in different spots in the pasture. As you're doing that, don't get distracted by the really tall tops of the grasses or some of the weeds. Really try to get a sense of the overall height where the plants are starting to be a little bit more density in the top of the canopy. And you're going to want to measure it in several different places, kind of like taking a soil test where you're really trying to get a composite idea of what the height is. And height is just one of the ways to figure out if the grasses in the pasture are ready to graze. And that pre-grazing height is going to vary depending on what your management goals are, because your pre-grazing height decision over time will actually change the plant species composition. So for example, if you want your pasture to turn into white clover and Kentucky bluegrass, you might go for a somewhat shorter pre-grazing height. If you're managing for something like smooth brome grass and bird's foot trefoil and forage chicory, one of my favorite pasture mixtures for dry soils particularly, in that case you're going to go for a longer regrowth period and a taller pre-grazing height, because that's what those plants really like. So again, plant height is just one of the ways to see if the pasture is ready to be grazed. If you don't have a measuring stick with you, you can use your hand. Everybody's hand is going to be a different measurement. Mine's about 5.5 inches from the bottom of the edge of the palm of my hand to the top of my thumb. And so what you do is you set it down on the soil, if you can find it. This is a nice dense pasture. And you get a sense of, okay, if that's 5.5 inches, then this pasture is, somewhere between 6 and 9 inches of height. That gets a little harder if you've got a tiny little hand like me and it's a pretty tall pasture. So I also use my boot. And if you've got, in this case, I've got my muck boots on and I've got a sense of like, how tall is it to the edge of here? How tall is it to the edge of here? So that's just another way to very quickly be constantly monitoring your pasture, thinking about the plant height. Make sure you're not only using the height to determine whether they're ready to be grazed, but it's a good quick thing to be thinking about as you're walking around your pastures. In addition to height, I also like to do leaf counting as another way to figure out how fully regrown your plants are since the last time they were grazed off, or in some cases mowed or clipped off. And so I'm going to go around the pasture in a lot of different spots, and I'm going to pick individual grass tillers. And I'm going to want to pick a lot of different grass tillers because these are highly diverse pastures. The area we're in here is a little bit poor quality, and so there's some fine leaf fescue in here. There's Kentucky bluegrass. There's a couple of different varieties of meadow fescue, and there's also some orchard grass. So I'm going to pick tillers and try to get them all the way down to the base. In this case, I actually got it with a little bit of the root on it, so that I'm looking at tillers. So this is the elongated tiller here, And I'm going to start counting the number of leaves that have regrown since the last time this area was grazed. And I've tried to pick several different species. And what I'm going to do with this is count how many leaves have grown since the last time that this got grazed. So here's a cool example where you can see this is the leaf that got bitten off by the cows the last time they went through this pasture and grazed this particular orchard grass plant. So you can see the top of this leaf is kind of flattened roughly by being bitten off by a cow. And since that plant was bitten off, this leaf re-elongated quite a bit, and then it started growing some new leaves. So here is a leaf. Oh no, look at this. I was wrong. This leaf was also bitten off by a cow. And you can see they just topped this orchard grass, as cows often will in the late summer. So that leaf also re-elongated. So those are two fairly old leaves. We're not going to count those in this leaf counting exercise. Here is a leaf. I'm going to check this one carefully. It's really pointy on the top. This one was not grazed off the last time that the cows came through. So that's one new leaf. And now here is a second new leaf. And then we have another leaf that's not yet fully formed here. So this tiller is in a 2.5 leaf stage, which is a little young for late summer or early fall grazing. I'd like that plant actually to be a little more physiologically mature for the perspective of making sure that plant has enough energy reserves to be grazed off again. So let's look at a couple of other species in this same pasture, since it's a highly diverse pasture. This is reed canary grass, and some of these leaves are getting pretty old and have been nibbled on by, looks like, grasshoppers. But these are all new leaves that have grown since the last grazing. So this plant in this same pasture is in a 3.5 leaf stage. There's an old one nibbled off by the cows. Here's 1, 2, 3 new leaves and part of another one. So the reed canary grass is ready. That particular orchard grass tiller isn't quite ready. And now we'll look at a couple of meadow fescue and some Kentucky bluegrass tillers. Looks like both of the meadow fescue that I picked here are in two slightly different stages of maturity. This one's almost at a 3.5 leaf stage, and this one's really in a 2.5 leaf stage. So the meadow fescue, some of it is not really quite ready to graze. Here's a little Kentucky bluegrass tiller, and it's also just got 1, 2, and a partial leaf. So this is 2.5 to 3 leaves. And then there's another orchard grass plant here. We'll look at this one. Some of the orchard grass out there was not grazed very much the last time the cows came through, because they will sometimes reject orchard grass in the late summer. And so some of them are more closer to being ready to be grazed. So this one has 1, 2, 3.5 new leaves. So that one is ready to graze. So this is actually a good example of a pasture that's a little bit low in fertility, doesn't have an ideal mix of grasses, doesn't have quite enough legume to fix nitrogen for the grasses in here yet. And so the regrowth in here is a little extra slow. And so this area, even though it looks kind of green and tall enough, it's really not ready to graze from a plant physiology standpoint. And it probably is a good place to take some soil tests, figure out what the limiting factors are, and start to increase the legume content out here so it'll grow better.
This video is brought to you by the Vermont Grass Farmers Association and the National Grazing Lands Coalition. It is partially funded by a USDA NRCS agreement.